Welcome to Grading the Avengers, a series where we go through every Avengers comic that's ever come out through Marvel history, and my thoughts on it and how they compare to one another. You know, when I started this series, which you should totally check out by clicking this button here, I didn't know I'd keep running into writers who are just some of the worst people in the industry, but here we are. Before we get into this round any further, if you enjoy comic reviews and other content, be sure to subscribe to our channel so you can also check out the rest of the series. Now, an interesting thing about this series is that there are some Avengers runs, like the Kirk Busiek and George Perez one we just did, that I knew well coming into them and enjoyed thoroughly beforehand. Others, like this one with Geoff Johns, I knew absolutely nothing about. And despite some very real grievances I and any other fair-minded individual might have against Geoff Johns at this point, we aren't really here to grade the person, rather the comics they make. And for those that don't know, when it comes to Geoff Johns, he doesn't have a terrible track record with this sort of thing based on his decades-long work with DC. When we consider some of his better works, like maybe Stargirl, Green Lantern, or the Justice League, while none of those comics were perfect, his take on superheroes and these characters did offer quite a bit in terms of content and ideas. They were far from terrible, so the potential for Geoff Johns to, at some point in history, have had the opportunity to write for the Avengers, in spite of everything, had me quite excited. I knew nothing about this run, and yes, while I dislike Geoff Johns as a person, I came into these Avengers books quite optimistic about how fun they might be, or what sort of ideas Johns was floating in the early 2000s, at a time before he clearly became exclusive with DC. Well, joke's on me, I guess, because this was the single greatest disappointment in all of Grading the Avengers, for me personally. While I truly didn't try to come into this run with any sort of grudge or anything like that, these Avengers books are just plain lousy, and a solid example of some of the worst habits from comics in the early 2000s. To Geoff Johns' credit, the books do feel like they were made at a time early in that man's career as a writer, before he really made his name with Green Lantern and Justice League. It's very evident that Johns is still visibly finding his strengths as a writer, bringing that opening story into this bizarre, high-level cosmic event that felt beyond anything the Avengers normally deal with. I feel like the markings of something Geoff Johns as a writer typically doesn't do. It feels because Geoff Johns was then a new writer, he couldn't and didn't really leverage his best qualities as a writer at the time. There aren't a cool new legion of characters or ideas like what he created for Green Lantern. He doesn't have fun with the team or established villains like he would almost a decade later with the Justice League, which feels particularly relevant given the similarity of these two teams. To be fair, it doesn't help that it feels like the sort of thing Geoff Johns would normally do is the exact sort of thing Kirk Busiek had already just done. So Johns probably felt compelled to take this series in a different direction beyond his normal comfort zone. The problem is, here in 2021, we kind of know from late-era Geoff Johns stories that the man, as a writer, has a very limited range in terms of what he's capable of. So when we get into some cosmic-level stuff with the In-Betweener, or whatever, Johns doesn't have the kind of interpersonal depth to explore the more lofty and high-powered beings of the Marvel Cosmic Order. Historically, this is not the sort of thing the guy is very good at, not when these Avengers books were made, and certainly not for other stuff Johns would later write with a similar being in Dr. Manhattan for the story Doomsday Clock. So, a story about the Avengers going up against this cosmic-level threat, superior to even Galactus, has the potential to be interesting if it were in the hands of somebody more thoughtful, like maybe Jim Starlin or Alan Hickman. Geoff Johns, in comparison, comes off quite short. Honestly though, that sort of just made Johns' early Avengers books dull, but not bad. It gets worse from here. Following the In-Betweener story, the Avengers comics descend into a bunch of boring nonsense that all consistently evoke the themes of the world around them at the time, in a very negative way. Published at the height of the Iraq War, the Avengers comics go from the relatively timeless and optimistic tones of the Kirk Busiek era and slam straight into Geoff Johns with a sudden sense of pessimism and 9/11 inspired imagery that just bums me right out. While there is a time and a place to explore such things, and the Avengers might very well be an effective way to do that, Geoff Johns feels even less equipped to handle this content than he does the cosmic Marvel stuff. To be fair, it is easy to understand how he got a little caught up in the political climate of the time, and he was likely moved to evoke some of the imagery coming out of the earlier 21st century. Just as a human being, I can relate to that. The books are not written too cynically, and I'm not saying they are offensive. Well, they are offensive, but offensively bad. And that's just in terms of the quality and my subjective opinion. These comics didn't come across as overly hateful to me. But the thing is, you can have a well-written, darker Avengers story, and it can pay off, often in ways more memorable and meaningful when compared to lighter, more comedic content. However, there's always a risk in going dark. When handled poorly, well, you get Geoff Johns' Avengers. Now, up until this point, I've been focused on the writing, but as always, that's only part of the equation when it comes to evaluating comics. Unfortunately for this era, I am not a fan of the art made for these books. It ranks very poorly when compared to Avengers history, with only stuff like Heroes Reborn looking worse. That's a very reductive thing to say for something very subjective, but the art by Kieron Dwyer absolutely constitutes this messy, miserable-looking disaster porn that permeates far too many comics from around this time period. I don't know much about Dwyer, but from what I've seen of his art, though it does have its moments, at the best I can say I'm not a fan, but more honestly I'd go so far as to call him amateurish. The kind of thing I really only give a pass to a low-level, indie comic where the talent's just starting out for the first time. Other artists like Ivan Reis fare better, but are just around for guest spots, while the second half of Johns' time with the Avengers, Olivier Coipel steps in. He, in comparison to Dwyer, comes across as much more competent, but then Geoff Johns goes and makes things miserable just the same. Meanwhile, as fallout from the Kirk Busiek arc, the Avengers are given international authority by the United Nations. It's an interesting idea that had been teased before in the comics and could have made the books more political or interesting, but instead nothing's really made of it. The books certainly try and appear political, but the politics are superficial. The message really doesn't seem to be much more complex than terrorism is bad. And I mean, yes, it's bad, but I don't really think we need an Avengers book to painstakingly spell that out for us. And in defense of that message, there was plenty of media being created from around this time that had that very simplistic tone to it. But at the very least, those things were entertaining along the way. And so ultimately, if the comics are neither thoughtful or fun, they have nowhere else to go. What could have been this memorable and awesome run where Geoff Johns, the guy who remade Green Lantern, inventing 9 additional Corps to fill out their universe, the dude who wrote one of my all-time favorite Justice League stories, Origins, along with other generally well-regarded Justice League works like Forever Evil and The Darkseid War. That guy wrote the Avengers, and it is sadly, utterly, completely skippable and forgettable. Whatever my feelings about the guy personally, I know Johns as a writer can be a lot of fun, so it's profoundly frustrating that not a hint of that joy exists in these Avengers books. Now, I know I've ragged a little hard on Johns throughout this review, and as a reminder, he absolutely deserves it, but I am going to come to the defense of him and pretty much any other writer we've talked about in this series. I've mentioned this before in Grading the Avengers, but not only are these grades subjective, but I don't really know the exact circumstances under which these comics were made. I, and basically no one but the people involved, don't know what conditions Geoff Johns was allowed to write the Avengers under. But we do know he was relatively new to this world of comics, and at the time I don't think he had a lot of creative control. We don't know what editors or executives might have been up to at the time, or how that might have affected Dwyer or Coipel's work along the way. I chose, knowing full well there was a lot of baggage to this, to use writers as a sort of earmark for eras in Avengers history in making this series, since they tend to best define distinct runs of comics within this series. However, we should never forget how collaborative these books really are, and often little things like coloring, which by the way, also wasn't really great in this particular run of Avengers books, that stuff can affect my final grade quite a bit, even if it doesn't necessarily involve Geoff Johns or his input or talents whatsoever. So, with all that in mind, yes, it's time for another hefty D, our third in the series so far, all within several years of one another in terms of publication time. Outside of the Jim Shooter era, this time in Avengers history, basically from the beginning of the Onslaught saga all the way into here, marks a pretty low point in the history of the Avengers, with the obvious exception of Kurt Busiek's run with George Perez. It seems like Marvel took the wrong lessons away from the Busiek and Perez's run in the decisions going forward. In my review for that run, I praised how great and timeless those early stories felt in Avengers Volume 3. Comparing that to the later stories with Geoff Johns is very rough because, for all these reasons I just described, this era contrasts heavily in terms of how dated it feels. Still, for all my criticisms, fans of the Johns run might note that this is a D+, a little bit higher than stuff like the Onslaught Business or Heroes Reborn, and an awfully lot higher than Jim Shooter's run, which is consistent with how I feel. While Geoff Johns' era was boring, gross, silly, full of problems, and thoughtless, it was still competently made compared to the true low points in Avengers history. But just barely. And that's it for this round. Next up, we'll close out Volume 3 with Chuck Austen. Like, holy crap, what the hell is gonna happen there? If you know who that is, that's really messed up. It's f***ed up. I don't know how else to describe it. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.